We have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we're holding a hearing on the opportunities and challenges in the Eastern Mediterranean. I would first like to thank Chairman Keating for hosting this hearing with me and especially for his leadership during these turbulent times in Europe. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses, Mr. Makovsky, Ms. de Carbonnel, Dr. Eissenstat, and Mr. Kagan. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to a terrific discussion. The Eastern Mediterranean is located at the intersection of some of the most dynamic regions in the world, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Over the span of a decade, major discoveries of energy resources and the development of large natural gas fields has kicked off a flurry of activity that catapulted the East Med into a region of strategic importance. As countries seek new ways to engage across the region, energy, diplomatic and security cooperation has greatly expanded, and the new opportunities continue to emerge in ways many once thought impossible. The U.S. Geological Survey has reported there are significant amounts of both natural gas and recoverable oil in the Eastern Mediterranean. Such energy opportunities have launched new and unlikely partnerships throughout the region. Since Israel's first natural gas discovery with the Tamar field off its coast in 2009, subsequent discoveries have been made in Israel, Cyprus, and Egypt, while Lebanon has been actively trying to assess its resources. The Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, headquartered in Cairo, has brought together countries like Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Egypt, Israel, the Palestinians, Jordan, to coordinate efforts and to improve regional energy integration. A remarkable achievement to have those countries sitting together in an international forum. The proposed East Med gas pipeline, which would have sent natural gas from Israel and Cyprus to Greece and from there on to the rest of Europe, has been put on ice as U.S. officials have recently dropped support for the project amid environmental and viability concerns. Nevertheless, U.S. has maintained its commitment to physically interconnecting East Med energy to Europe through projects such as the planned Euro-Africa interconnector from Egypt to the island of Crete and the Greek mainland, as well as the proposed Euro-Asia interconnector to link the Israeli, Cypriot, and European electricity grids. I know our witnesses will speak to all of these decisions and issues. As Russia continues its unjust war in Ukraine, alternative energy sources will be essential to curtailing Putin's power and ensuring European energy security. I am eager to hear from our witnesses on opportunities to support future initiatives and cooperation in the region. Dramatic expansion of diplomatic engagement and coordination has given the Eastern Mediterranean new weight in the regional architecture. Greece and Cyprus have strengthened diplomatic relations with Jordan, Egypt, and Israel to foster economic, energy, and military cooperation, as well as to defend against external malign influences. The 3+1 mechanism between the U.S., Greece, Cyprus, and Israel has been a profound success, initiating unprecedented regional cooperation and collaboration in support of energy independence and security. I'm proud to chair the Congressional Hellenic Israel Alliance here in Congress, which we formed back in 2013 during nascent cooperation between these countries. And finally, opportunities in the East Med have strengthened cooperation in bilateral relationships between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon as Middle Eastern countries look for ways to increase stability and security in the region. And while energy has formed the basis of these relationships, we have quickly seen these grow into real strategic partnerships. Greece is currently hosting 7 countries, including Cyprus and Israel, in its Iniokos exercise, which simulates a variety of scenarios, including airstrikes, invading air defenses, and combat search and rescue operations. Middle Eastern countries that do not formally recognize Israel, like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, are participating in these drills as observers. As Israel transitions from EUCOM to CENTCOM area of responsibility, seamless integration between Europe and the Middle East is of paramount importance to regional security. And it's with this goal in mind that I'm proud of the passage of both the Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act and the U.S.-Greece Defense and Interparliamentary Partnership Act. These pieces of legislation made historic investments in Greece's military, called for the repeal of the arms embargo on the Republic of Cyprus, and authorized the establishment of the U.S. Eastern Mediterranean Energy Center. These tools Congress supported are integral to strengthening U.S. partnerships with Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, and I urge the administration to ensure their full implementation. Despite such close cooperation, many challenges in the Eastern Mediterranean remain unresolved and have proven barriers to further integration. Disputes between Turkey and Greece on maritime borders, island ownership, and exclusive economic zones, as well as the unresolved nature and stalled negotiations on the Cyprus problem, have proven challenging. An influx of migrants and refugees from North Africa into Europe have exacerbated tensions in the region, and negotiations between Israel and Lebanon on disputed maritime boundaries are ongoing. And finally, long-standing concerns about Russia and Syria, the Syria regime's involvement in the Middle East, remain ever present. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the role that the U.S. can play in addressing all of these challenges. The importance of the Eastern Mediterranean has often been overlooked, and yet partnerships and cooperation have flourished beyond what many thought possible. Support for such efforts in the U.S. has been met with consistent and strong bipartisan support, but we've got to keep pushing, keep emphasizing the importance of the East Med as a bastion of energy, diplomacy, and security cooperation that will serve as a model for the rest of the region. I cannot stress enough the importance of the hearing that we're holding today. I hope that this is the first of many that the House Foreign Affairs Committee will host on the opportunities and challenges in the Eastern Mediterranean and the ways in which the U.S. can not only highlight, but actively strengthen the regional architecture that is emerging in the Eastern Mediterranean. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these important issues, and I'm now pleased to yield to my friend, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, first for his opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Deutch and Chairman Keating, for holding this timely hearing today, and to our panel of experts for being with us today. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has heightened concerns about European dependence on Russian energy. And additionally, the war has prompted renewed interest in Eastern Mediterranean natural gas resources as a possible partial offset of Russian oil supply to Europe. Currently, Russia supplies about 40% of the EU's natural gas consumption, and Turkey is a large importer of Russian natural gas. The Eastern Mediterranean region relies on oil and natural gas to supply most of its total energy needs. And moreover, reactors under construction at the Russian-sponsored nuclear power plant, Akkuyu, in Turkey are scheduled to come online from 2023 to 2026 and are projected to supply about 10% of Turkey's electricity needs. So as this unjustified, unprovoked war in Ukraine carries on, it's essential that we as a country assist our allies in the Eastern Mediterranean region and ensure that they have the tools they need to be energy independent from Russia. The United States has shown its willingness to engage with the Eastern Mediterranean region through legislation such as the fiscal year 2022 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that established a European recapitalization incentive program intended to assist Greece in meeting its defense needs and transitioning away from Russian-produced military equipment. And I was also proud to support the bipartisan Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act, which aims to diversify Europe's energy resources away from Kremlin-controlled companies. So I want to thank our esteemed guests for being here during such a critical time, and I look forward to hearing from your perspective on the opportunities and challenges facing the Eastern Mediterranean region. Again, thank you to Chairman Deutch and Keating for hosting this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. It's now my pleasure to recognize Chairman Keating for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Deutch and Ranking Member Wilson, for your leadership and the work you've done and the important issues we're going to discuss today, and for holding this hearing in conjunction with myself and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick of the European Subcommittee. The Middle East and Europe have long been inextricably linked by geography, culture, economic interest, and security cooperation. I'm glad to be able to explore these bonds in today's hearing. I'm so very pleased to be working in such a collaborative way with our colleagues. The Eastern Mediterranean, while a strategically vital region for the entire international community, is also the physical representation of the linkages between Europe and the Middle East. From the Aegean to the Ionian Seas, from Jordan to Cyprus, from Eastern Mediterranean, this area comprises rich and diverse populations, abundant resources, and complex regional dynamics that we would be mindful to prioritize as a part of U.S. foreign policy. Regions also of vital importance to alliances, of which the U.S. depends upon. Greece and Cyprus represent the outer bonds of the EU, while Greece and Turkey, despite differences, defend the southeastern flank of the NATO alliance. Furthermore, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt's geostrategic locations only enhance the region's significance to the United States. Today, the Eastern Mediterranean is at a crossroads with multiple competing challenges. The U.S. should really be concerned and involved in these challenges, and this includes ongoing political upheaval and resource competition resulting in increased divisions and instability in the region, rapid seawater warming and increased heat, wave frequency increases, pollution, non-native invasive species, overfishing, all direct or indirect effects of climate change, increased levels of migration to asylum seekers who face upheaval at home, and intense energy and oil competition in the region that has significant and far-reaching consequences. While these challenges are just the top lines, they are by no means the only threats U.S. policymakers should take into consideration. For example, in the past few years, Putin has deployed mercenaries to Libya, stoked the flames of civil war in Syria, enhanced dependencies on Russian oil and gas, and has played spoiler in several regional disputes. Now, Putin is violating Ukraine's sovereignty, terrorizing the country's people, creating reverberating effects for global and European security. This includes food insecurity in the Middle East, Africa, and throughout the world, as many countries and NGOs depend on Ukrainian grain. As the war rages, the likelihood of food products not reaching market is rising, and all countries, including those in the Middle East and Africa, who depend on these food imports will suffer. The Biden administration must continue to lead on this issue, and we in Congress must continue to work with our allies to address looming food insecurity to ultimately dampen the ripple effects of the illegal invasion. With strong regional actors and significant potential for progress, the United States, as well as our European allies and partners, should encourage stability in the Eastern Mediterranean area. As a step, the United States must re-enter and develop a strong and collaborative, particularly in areas of politics, military, and above all, economic involvement. But more importantly, the U.S. must present itself as pragmatic and as advantageous as a partner to all these competing influences in the area. We must flex our transatlantic muscles, work with our allies and partners, and create a global community approach to achieving a stable Eastern Mediterranean. In addition, U.S. allies in the Eastern Mediterranean must also play an important role in responding to Russian aggression against Ukraine. For example, Turkey should restrict Russian access to the Black Sea, institute sanctions on Russian businesses similar to those of the US, EU, and the UK, and provide assistance to Ukrainians. Further, key energy producing countries should work with European partners to find alternatives to Russian energy sources to finally end Europe's historical dependence on Russian energy. Throughout my tenure as chair of this subcommittee, I've stressed the importance of US-European cooperation on a variety of pressing global issues. The Eastern Mediterranean is the perfect example of a way to nourish further transatlantic cooperation and to continue to work to repair and to grow our partnerships. Now, at this pivotal moment, I'm eager to talk about the role of the Eastern Mediterranean and how it should play into US foreign policy in an effort to address energy security in Europe, pressing climate issues, and regional security cooperation. To our expert witnesses, thank you very much for being here today. I look forward to hearing your perspective on how the U.S. and the transatlantic community can work to promote stability and prosperity in the Eastern Mediterranean. And again, I thank Chair Deutch and Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick for their participation today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I don't see Ranking Member Wilson yet. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the witnesses, and when we see the Ranking Member, we will yield to him. I'm going to ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared remarks will be made part of the hearing record, and we're really grateful for your participation today. Mr. Alan Makovsky is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. From 2001 to 2013, he served as a senior professional staff member on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, where he covered the Middle East, Turkey, and other related issues. Before that, Makovsky worked at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and at the State Department as special advisor to the Special Middle East Coordinator, among other various positions. And Alan, it is a pleasure to welcome you back to the committee. Ms. Alissa de Carbonnel is the Deputy Program Director for Europe and Central Asia at the International Crisis Group, where she oversees research and advocacy in and about Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Alissa has over a decade of experience reporting in the region for Reuters and other media outlets, including from the front lines of conflicts in Ukraine, Georgia, and the North Caucasus. She also worked for Reuters in Brussels as the EU energy and climate correspondent and as a Moscow-based reporter. Welcome, Ms. de Carbonnel. Dr. Howard Eissenstat is an associate professor of history at St. Lawrence University, where he teaches courses on Middle East history and politics, as well as being a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Dr. Eissenstat focuses on contemporary Turkish domestic and foreign policy, especially on issues of rule of law, minority rights, and the reshaping of political culture under the AKP. He has also lectured at the Foreign Service Institute of the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Military, and Canadian Foreign Service Institute. And finally, welcome, Dr. Eissenstat. And finally, Dr. Frederick Kagan is a senior fellow and director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. In 2009, he served in Kabul, Afghanistan, as part of General McChrystal's strategic assessment team. He returned to Afghanistan in 2010, 11, and 12 to conduct research for Generals David Petraeus and John Allen. In July 2011, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, awarded him the Distinguished Public Service Award for his volunteer service in Afghanistan. It's always good to have Dr. Kagan. Thanks to all of you for being here today. And still seeing no Ranking Member Wilson, I'll recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each. Without objection, your prepared statements will be part of the record. And Mr. Makovsky, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Deutch, Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, and honorable members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. On a personal note, I have to say that it is a thrill and an honor for me to be back, at least virtually, at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where I was privileged to serve as a staffer for 12 years and learned so much. Mr. Chairman, the Eastern Mediterranean is a term that has emerged over the past decade or so as issues in Europe and the Middle East began to cross regional boundaries at an unprecedented level. 3 developments were key in this regard. First, major natural gas finds offshore in Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus. Second, Russia's 2015 intervention in Syria, which marked the first post-Soviet return of Russia to the Middle East and gave it a base for injecting proxies into Libya and sub-Saharan Africa. And third, Turkey's emergence as an aggressive interventionist power in the Arab Middle East, as well as the Aegean and Mediterranean. Particularly in recent years, these developments have been playing out against a backdrop of a regionally perceived and real drawdown of US forces in the region. These developments have led to intensified conflict in the region, but also some instances of unprecedented cross-regional cooperation and the prospect of opportunities to advance US interests. Chairman Deutch, you have enumerated a number of these cooperative efforts, including the ones initiated by the Hellenic states, Greece and Cyprus, separately with Israel, with Egypt, with Jordan, with India, with others. You've also mentioned the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which was founded in 2019, chaired and initiated by Egypt, whose Zohr gas field is the Eastern Med's largest. You've mentioned the interesting membership, 4 EU members as well as 2 Arab states, the Palestinian Authority and Israel. It's a remarkable grouping, and it's not inconceivable, and indeed should be encouraged that a group like this could grow out from its focus on gas and become the basis of much wider regional cooperation. Of the Hellenic-initiated trilateral groups that I've referred to, the one that has received the most attention is the one that includes Israel. It's the most institutionalized of the groups. Its origins are in the early part of the second decade of this century, but it was formally begun in 2016 and supplemented by the US when Secretary of State Pompeo joined its ministerial in 2019. It then became known as the 3+1. What makes the 3+1, the one being the United States, particularly noteworthy and deserving of strong US support is that it groups the 3 most democratic states in the East Med. The Biden administration has endorsed the 3+1 concept, but is yet to hold a joint ministerial with the 3. And I know from conversations with representatives of the other 3 that they are looking forward to the time when that ministerial that with the United States will take place. As you mentioned, there are also cross-regional cooperative efforts between the East Med and the Gulf, particularly Greece and Israel, with Gulf forms of collaboration. But the key point is this. The old regional divisions are less rigid than they used to be. The map is changing in that regard, and the US, without excessive investment, can help to shape it. In brief, my recommendations are these, with greater elaboration and greater number of recommendations in my written testimony. First, intensify US diplomatic involvement across the board with these clusters of friendly states, and try to merge these clusters to the extent possible. Direct senior level involvement with these clusters will enforce the US's ability to shape the strategic outlook and key strategic decisions taken by members of these clusters. In short, create +1s wherever possible. For example, US involvement as a +1 in the trilaterals that Greece and Cyprus have with Israel and Egypt could enhance the possibility of greater Israeli-Egyptian normalization. That is clearly in the US interest, as it reinforces the 43-year-old Israeli-Egyptian peace, which is the foundation stone of what stability exists in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Second, the US should consider how it can support expansion of the LNG facilities at Damietta and Idku in Egypt, and development of the planned regasification unit in Alexandroupoli, Greece. There is no doubt that the Russian war on Ukraine increases the importance of getting East Med gas to Europe. Politically,
Mr. Makovsky, I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to ask if you could try to wrap up.
Okay, so I'll just say politically, the LNG route, Egypt to Greece, seems to me the most immediately practical. Third, I'd like to see the US redouble efforts to solve the Cyprus problem, which is the biggest blockage to coordination in the Eastern Med. And I would just like to add that we know that the question of how to handle Turkey is hovering over this discussion. The US has to devote attention to that, look to ways to integrate Turkey into the region. Ultimately, I believe Turkey is going to have to come more to the region, including find some way to recognize the Republic of Cyprus in order to integrate itself and provide long-term stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Makovsky, and we look forward to a healthy exchange of ideas during the question and answer. Next, Ms. de Carbonnel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, Chair Keating, Ranking Members Wilson and Fitzpatrick, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on energy diplomacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. As mentioned, the debate comes at a really important time when Russia's war in Ukraine is renewing this interest in the region as an alternative source of energy supplies for Europe. At the International Crisis Group, where I'm the deputy head of the Europe and Central Asian program, we have analysts throughout the region. And so my perspective today is shaped by the field research and advocacy of those analysts in countries all around the East Med Basin. A decade ago, some US and European diplomats hoped that gas discoveries would entirely reshape relations among countries in the East Med Basin, that they would bring this greater stability and new gas supplies to Europe. So far, they have fallen short of those big ambitions. The region's complex geography and regional rivalries have made it too costly to exploit the gas potential as an alternative for Europe to Russian gas supplies, especially given the continent's move to decarbonize. Today, that calculus may be shifting. War in Europe is upending the continent's energy policy and making cutting dependence on Russia an almost existential question. The past decade of energy diplomacy in the region, I think, holds really important lessons for us. Each country in the region sees gas discoveries, real and anticipated, as a lifeline, a guarantee of energy self-sufficiency, economic growth, regional sway. So too, US and European policy must take this broad view of overlapping ambitions. Energy ties have mostly blossomed among states at peace, that were ready and willing to expand trade. That's the case with Israel when it cut deals to send gas to Jordan and to Egypt. Among other actors, gas sector competition may even act as a proxy battlefield. For example, Turkey's talks with Libya on maritime borders have sharpened its confrontation with Egypt, the Republic of Cyprus, and Greece. Members of the East Med Gas Forum, aforementioned, are also united in their opposition to Turkey. Ankara responded with gunboat diplomacy. It has sent drill ships with naval escorts into contested waters to defend what it sees as its rights and those of Turkish Cypriots. This kind of brinkmanship led to the dangerous standoff we saw with Greece in the summer of 2020. For a few tense weeks, we saw the full power of the Greek and Turkish fleets facing off. It was really one of the longest lasting in a cycle of periodic crises since the 1970s over their competing sovereignty claims. More recently, Ankara is making efforts to break its isolation, to improve ties with Israel, Egypt, and the UAE, and this appears to be easing tensions in the region. But I'd also like to point out that more than politics in these regional rivalries, it's commercial realities that has so far kept gas from being piped to Europe. Cyprus and Israel's big gas fields have struggled to make the case for sufficient demand. The Biden administration's withdrawal of support for the East Med gas pipeline that Chairman Deutch mentioned is an acknowledgement of widespread skepticism over its viability. The question now is how profoundly Russia's war in Ukraine will be a game changer. If Europe was once concerned with diversification, today the goal is clearly to phase out oil, gas, and coal imports from Russia entirely. That's really a tall order. Even before the war, Europe was roiling from its worst energy crisis since the 70s. It hits drivers at the pumps, families heating homes. We saw a reduction in some industrial output. So already EU leaders are making really radical decisions. 2 months ago, Germany still intended to buy more Russian gas through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That has obviously been halted. Berlin is building its first LNG import terminal, and it's activating the first stage in an energy rationing plan. Poland has been even more radical and is ready to go cold turkey on Russian coal, oil, and gas imports. To cope, Europe is burning more coal, running LNG terminals and other import pipelines from Norway and Algeria at capacity, fast-tracking green energy projects, and seeking additional oil barrels from the Middle East and elsewhere. The White House is working with EU leaders to soften the blow, including by increasing LNG exports to Europe this year. Still, that remains a fraction of what is currently being imported from Russia via pipelines. Also, it's worth noting that longstanding US and EU efforts to weaken Russia's grip over markets in Southeast Europe, where the East Med geographically has been very important in offering new gas supplies, is also paying off. So when it comes to new big investments to unlock more gas in the East Med, today's urgency, though, will rub up against long-term climate goals. As mentioned, the quickest way to boost supplies to Europe is to ship them via Egypt, if Israel and Egypt can increase production. Egypt's Jorg super gas field makes it the region's gas linchpin. It has the most developed export capacity, and it has a large domestic market to absorb additional imports from Israel and elsewhere. Assuming that Europe remains, as it should, committed to greening its economy, bigger plans such as the East Med gas pipeline or a more recent proposal by Turkey for a pipeline connecting it to Israel remain doubtful. Such projects would only come online in a number of years and may struggle to secure public financing given climate priorities. US gas diplomacy has led to successes in the region. We've mentioned a number of examples, the 3+1 meetings, which has paved the way now for a project to link their electricity grids, the deals between Israel, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. The East Med Gas Forum, in many ways, is a case study in how energy can act as a bridge for closer cooperation. The U.S. is also engaged in
Ms. de Carbonnel, hi, I'm sorry, if I could just ask you to try to wrap up.
Sure. So I just wanted to mention that, in other cases, the region's seabed riches have exacerbated tensions. And I think that Washington's role in these multilateral groupings for energy dialogue lends them an important legitimacy, and it should continue to advance projects there that are aligned with its stated climate goals and that whose appeal doesn't come from their source as a competition for rivals in the region. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Dr. Eissenstat, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairmans Deutch and Keating, ranking members Wilson and Fitzpatrick, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Even before February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Eastern Mediterranean has been a focus of intense interest, not least because of several years of aggressive Turkish activity. More recently, Ankar's attempts at resetting relations with regional powers have raised questions as to whether a new era of cooperation is in the offing. I don't think it is, but I do think there are opportunities for making a dangerous situation less dangerous. Turkey is, in many respects, a perfect example of the increasingly complicated diplomatic field on which the United States must now operate. Ankara is neither going to be a reliable ally, nor should we think of it as a new enemy. Turkey's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a case in point. It's shaped not only by its NATO alliance, but also by longstanding cooperation with Kiev. Its relationship with Moscow is marked by both partnership and rivalry. Ankara wants to preserve Ukrainian independence, but it will avoid a clear break with Russia. Its contributions to Ukraine have therefore been carefully calibrated to support Ukraine while avoiding Russian ire. For its part, Moscow too wants to avoid a break with Turkey and ideally manufacture a fracture between Turkey and NATO. Aside from drones, Turkey's other contributions to Ukraine have won plaudits, but frankly, are a lot less significant. In the meantime, Turkey has not closed its airspace to Russian flights, nor has it joined in sanctions. Russian oligarchs have sailed their yachts to Turkish ports as safe haven from confiscation. From the beginning of the crisis, Turkey has combined its support for Ukraine with criticism of NATO. While recent polling indicates broad public support for Ukraine, nearly half of Turkish citizens blame NATO for the crisis. For those who follow Turkey closely, these results are not surprising. They reflect longstanding distrust of Turkey's Western allies, which have been intensified by anti-Western rhetoric from government officials and pro-government media. The issue here goes beyond specific policy questions like the S-400s. Intractable as many of these may seem, they are signs of broader issues in US-Turkish relations. President Erdogan believes that the West is attempting to overturn him. This is the prism through which he sees the Gezi protests of 2013, the attempted coup of 2016, and the current economic crisis. In the aftermath of the attempted coup, the Turkish government detained a number of US citizens and local US consular staff. Under pressure, US citizens have been freed, but our consular staff have not been. Similar fantasies of US support for the coup are the rationale for the prosecution of one of Turkey's most important civil society leaders, Osman Kavala, and a US citizen, Henri Barkey. Barkey is safely in the United States, but Kavala has been jailed on Kafkaesque charges for more than 4 years, despite ECHR rulings that he should be released. These prosecutions are, of course, important because of what they say about the weakness of rule of law in Turkey. Thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of others have been similarly abused. But what I want to highlight today is the extent to which antagonism towards the United States and a belief in Washington's ill will towards Turkey are now woven into the fabric of Turkey's political culture. The basic distrust of the United States and the West more generally is one reason why I'm dubious about the prospects that Turkey's current reset is anything other than short-term correction, a consolidation of gains and a mitigation of costs in the face of a profound economic crisis. One last consideration is that Turkey is facing elections in June 2023. A tremendous amount rides on these elections. Erdogan is more electorally vulnerable now than at any point in his political life. It is in part for this reason that he's so anxious to diminish diplomatic tensions in the region and thereby reassure markets. The Ukraine crisis has brought the EU and the United States together in ways that seemed unimaginable a few months ago. We will be most effective in the East Mediterranean to the extent that we can work closely with the EU. In Turkey, we should remain alert to opportunities for cooperation, but treat overtures from Ankara with care unless they are occupied by tangible action. For a true reset of Turkish-US relations, Turkey needs to demonstrate that it's willing to address US concerns, and it needs to remain committed to the basic precepts of electoral democracy. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eissenstat. Dr. Kagan, before going to you, I see that Ranking Member Wilson has joined. So with your indulgence, I will yield to Ranking Member Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ted Deutch, and I want to thank you and Chairman Bill Keating for calling this timely hearing on U.S. policy in the Eastern Mediterranean region. It is impossible to examine challenges and opportunities in the region without addressing the horrific strategic goals of Putin. In Libya, Putin makes his support for warlord Khalifa Haftar clear as he furthers his destabilization efforts. In Tartus, Putin has the only warm water naval base outside of the former Soviet socialist dictatorship, which he uses to prop up the criminal Assad regime and further his goals in the region. Putin's war in Ukraine serves as a sobering reminder that peace through strength is key to preventing future aggression. As identified this week by President Biden, we're in a long-term conflict between autocracy, rule of gun, against democracy, rule of law. Malign actors such as Putin, the Chinese Communist Party, and the mullahs of Iran intend to create an environment of dependence and disproportionate leverage in the Eastern Mediterranean under the guise of security assistance and infrastructure investment, though there are indications that his plans have had limited success. The United States and democratic allies have a real opportunity to capitalize on Putin's incompetence and to step in as reliable alternative. We should increase cooperation with the valued ally of NATO in mutual areas of mutual concern. Turkey, of course, is an ally that fought side by side with us from Korea and stood with us in every conflict for the past 70 years and has been a democracy now approaching 100 years. Turkey's decision to sell and collaborate with Ukraine and the Bayraktar TB2 drones has been rightfully praised. An issue in the heart of all this is energy independence. The Biden administration's decision to withdraw support from the East Med pipeline which would aid in Europe's energy diversification by supplying natural gas by way of Israel and Greece. This shows a real lack of foresight. The United States, along with their allies, should support any effort to reduce dependence on Russian commodities and work with regional partners. It should bolster in every way the belief that Putin has nothing to offer them. Extremist energy policies have led to dependence on Russian oil and dependence on Chinese batteries. I thank our witnesses for their time and expertise, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. And with that, we will go to our final witness's testimony. Dr. Kagan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman, ranking members, for holding this timely hearing and giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. And I want to thank all in Congress for their support to Ukraine and their work to isolate Russia, which has been incredibly important for American policy and for the people of Ukraine and free peoples around the world. It's hard to overstate the implications of what's going on in Ukraine right now. And I think that we need to recognize that this actually is a world historical moment, as the Soviets would have called it. Touch briefly on a few of the aspects of that I think are most salient for these subcommittees, and I'll be happy to discuss anything in more detail, of course, in question and answer. Russia is in the midst of expending its conventional military in the war in Ukraine. Our current assessment is that Russia will not have a usable conventional military at the end of this war until it reconstitutes one. That will mark of course, dramatic change in the world situation and the situation in the Middle East as well. It is demonstrating a degree of military weakness that I and many other military analysts did not expect, as well as a degree of military incompetence. And that has a series of important implications for the region, which I discuss more in my written testimony. Most important for the United States and its allies is that we really have to stop fearing the Russian conventional military in the region. And I think it's important to examine ourselves and our past policies in the region and reflect on how much of those policies was driven by fear of getting into some kind of conflict with the Russian conventional military because we feared the conventional military rather than because of escalation concerns, and stop fearing it. They should fear us, we should not fear them. There are also implications from the possible drawdown of Russian forces in the region. We've seen indications that the Russians are beginning to pull some of their forces back from Syria and Libya and so on. It's too soon to tell how significant that will be, but it is important to recognize that the Russian forces in both of those countries have been an important element in sustaining the pseudo-stability, which is the best I think that one could call it, in both countries. And their withdrawal could lead to significant changes in both countries as rivals jockey to replace the Russians, again, depending on how complete the Russian withdrawal or pullback actually is. The most important implications, though, are that we have to understand that the threat of Putinism is a permanent threat. And I'm coining the term Putinism advisedly. It's not enough to say that Putin mustn't remain in power, and I have no interest in getting into that particular debate at the moment. But the point is that Putin has spent 20 years creating an ideology that he is now executing. And it is not acceptable anymore to have someone who is adhering to Putinism even after Putin goes in Russia. And by not acceptable, I mean it will mean that Russia remains an enemy of the United States, the free world, and our allies, and a threat to be dealt with. I'm not advocating that we engage in regime change in Russia. But if we accept that Putinism is a permanent threat, at least as long as it exists, we then have to change the way that we are thinking about interacting with Russia. And that gets directly to a lot of the issues that have been discussed already in testimony and in opening statements. Sanctions, as many people imagine them, seem to be thought of as a temporary phenomenon that will be used to coerce the Russians into pulling back and doing various other things in Ukraine. I don't think that sanctions will actually do that. I think that we will have to support the Ukrainians in military counteroffensive to accomplish that. But I also think that we have to stop imagining that sanctions are likely to be temporary. I think we need to go back actually to a Cold War model here and reflect on what would be required structurally to exclude Russia from the global economic and geopolitical order as we structurally excluded the Soviet Union. And that means that we really do have to think about helping our European allies make a permanent shift away from reliance on Russian energy and finding alternative energy sources, even as they continue to advance their objectives toward green energy and so forth. And it means that we have to abandon the notion that we can ever regard Russia as a partner anywhere. We can work with Russia as an enemy. We worked with the Soviet Union as an enemy. We were explicit that the Soviets were an enemy. They were explicit that we were their enemy. We worked with them nevertheless where it was appropriate. But we never imagined that they were a partner. And yet sometimes we still use language about Russia as if we could somehow partner with Russia on areas of common interest, however small they might be. And I would say that as we consider the problem of structurally excluding Russia from the global economic order and geopolitical order, and reverting to a more appropriately modified Cold War mindset, we have to recognize that Russia is an enemy, that one can work with one's enemies, but one can do that without losing sight of the fact that they are enemies. And I think that if we take that as a guiding principle, we will be able to develop a sounder policy that will serve our interests and those of our allies much better. I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kagan. I thank you and all the witnesses and all the members for being here today. Witnesses, I appreciate your testimony, and members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions, which we will get to at the end. But let me just go to the questions from the members now. I'm going to recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all of the time yielded will be for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority in a rotation, beginning with majority member of our subcommittee, moving to a majority member, a minority member of our subcommittee, then to majority of the Europe subcommittee and minority member. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know. We'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will defer my time until the end, so I will start by recognizing Mr. Keating, of course, Chairman Keating. For 5 minutes, you are recognized.
Thank you. Dr. Eissenstat, I want to begin because I share with you the concern for Turkey that's there and the less than optimistic view that you've had right now. But I want to say this. With Russia right now, most military experts are saying this is going to extend with Ukraine and with the West 5, 10, maybe more years. So it's a longer term, and it's going to have effect. The sanctions, I hope and trust, will last during that period too, maybe compound. So Russia is becoming an economic pariah. It'll be a political pariah. It's weakened militarily. So with Turkey, I've got to ask, they're a country that came to me early on when I was a congressman, so concerned about trade issues, so concerned that the EU would move ahead with a trade agreement with the US and they'd be left out. So their connection with Russia makes no sense. As we go ahead with the Technology Council, as we go ahead with supply chain issues that are bringing us closer together on these economic issues with our European allies, it just makes no sense. Longer range for Turkey not to change. I think the handwriting's on the wall, and even locally in Istanbul and other areas, democratic efforts are there. So things are moving in one direction. The future's clear. So I'm asking you because I have the same pessimism that you do at the current, but I think things are going to have to change just out of reality. Can you follow that up and tell me what you think as someone that shares that concern?
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I think that if we look at this from outside, your logic is fully workable, right? That if we look at Turkey's real interests are to build ties certainly within the region, but especially with the European Union, which is, after all, its biggest trading partner and has the most to offer, with the United States as well. Its best interests are with the West. As a historian, ideology and national memory and the worldview of historical actors often takes precedence of what's in their best interest. And I think Putin's choices over the last month or so are evidence of that. So I take your logic, and I think I agree with it. I think that a lot depends going forward on just how badly off Russia is. And I think that I'm constitutionally maybe a little bit more pessimistic than other witnesses in that I think that there are ways in which, despite Russia's difficulties, things can swing Russia's way on the longer term. I'm thinking of the unwillingness of most of the world outside of our closest allies.
I want to interrupt just because
Sure.
time is leading. So what could the U.S. do other than what we're doing? I mean, we've reached out to the mayor of Istanbul. We've reached out to other people for hearings. But I think this is a card that we have to play. And we can't just wait for Turkey to come up to this stance alone. We have to draw them in out of their own self-interest, their own sovereign interest. So I understand the corruption issues. I understand the other issues. But clearly the U.S. can do something. Can you give us an example of what we could do to bring about that realization of reality?
I think that we can look to addressing their economic issues on the short term. I think that we can reassure them that the extent to which they support our sanctions on Russia, we will be trying to support them. But I think that other than putting forward the carrot of these are all the things that we can provide if you're willing to work closely with us. I think we have to wait for them.
Okay,
or have to
my
wait for the
time
next
is
election.
up. I apologize. But as other witnesses maybe answer questions, if there's time to fit in to this theme, that would be great too. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I now recognize Ranking Member Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, and thank you, Chairman Keating. I share your view and that of Dr. Eisenstadt, and we need to do all we can to restore the extraordinary alliance that the United States and Turkey have had for 100 years, and we need to be working on that. With Dr. Kagan, I just think it's sadly bizarre that environmental extremists prevailed to delay the East Med pipeline, which benefits Putin. What alternatives could be feasible in terms of delivering that regional natural gas and supplies to European and global markets? And how can the pipeline be revived to reduce benefiting Putin, who obviously is fighting a war for oil, money, power to kill people in Ukraine?
Congressman, I'm very sorry. You've asked an excellent question, but it's beyond my expertise to explain how that pipeline could be revived. All I can say is that it's extremely important that we find every possible way of replacing Russian energy supplies to Europe with supplies from other sources.
Well, I'm amazed because you and Elaine are superstars. And so additionally, another question, Dr. Kagan, I've been concerned about our great ally, Israel, that they have been restrained in helping Ukraine. What can we do to address Israel's fears of Russian influence and presence in Syria? And to me, Israel should be standing firm, as we have with the European Union, with NATO. All the countries on earth have been really very ahead of the curve to defend the people of Ukraine, except for fully Israel, and sadly, I'm so disappointed. The world's largest democracy, India, has not done what they should be doing to be the valued allies of democracy in America that we count on.
Sir, I'm also baffled at the Israeli position on this. I'm less surprised at the Indian position, which is, as you say, though, incredibly disappointing. I'm confident that anything that the Ukrainians can do to the Russian military, the Israelis could do 10 or 100 times better. And so I don't understand why the Israelis should continue to be nervous about the Russian military presence in Syria if that's what's driving their policy. My main concern here is, although it would be very helpful to have the Israelis help more, I worry about the impact of the position the Israelis have taken over the long term on Israel itself. I simply think that this hesitating and equivocating is not going to age well for Israel, because it's very clear what the right side of history is here. Many countries are on the right side of history. And I think it would behoove Israel and, of course, India to move there as well as quickly as possible.
And Dr. Kagan, I really am concerned for Israel that clearly we have Putin attempting to reclaim Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. Then that would encourage the Chinese Communist Party to take over the 23 million people of Taiwan. But then the next part of the triumvirate, of course, are the mullahs of Tehran. And they don't want to take over the territory of Israel. They want to vaporize, and they've said this over and over again, the people of Israel. And just this week, again, the different attacks in the last 2 weeks, and the just incredible situation developing, and indeed, with the missile attacks by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and against the U.S. consulate in Erbil. They're flaunting, and we need good people of both parties. And hey, I do want to point out something that Putin's done. Okay, he has really united Republicans and Democrats. He's united NATO. He has and brought Germany to the table to be as they should be, a vital part of Western security. And then, and equally significant, it's startling to me as the co-chair EU caucus to find out that the European Union, 27 countries, are providing military equipment to Ukraine. I didn't know they had military equipment. And so sadly, but this is the time for all of us to be working together, and we need our allies of Turkey to be, and they are, and then Israel and India. So I look forward to working with Chairman Deutch as he's going to accomplish everybody coming together. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to you, Chairman Deutch, and to Chairman Keating, and to our ranking members for convening this hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses for their really important testimony. Mr. Makovsky, I'd like to begin with you. I think one of the most promising parts of cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean has obviously been increasing the security cooperation, and the Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership provided for the lifting of the arms embargo on the Republic of Cyprus. All the conditions of lifting that embargo have been met, as Cyprus has suspended Russian port calls, and the Republic of Cyprus has proven to be a really strong partner in imposing sanctions on Russians and also in our anti-terrorism work. And my question is, in the interest of promoting regional security cooperation and really checking the malign influences in the Eastern Mediterranean, isn't it time to fully lift the arms embargo on Cyprus so it can work as a better partner with the U.S. and our allies in the region in their cooperative work? I think you're on mute. Oh, they'll stop the clock.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, I do think it's time to lift the embargo. I mean, I think we have to see how enduring the suspension of the port visits are. Because I know that's a key congressional condition. And I think the operative part of what you said is where it serves U.S. interests. And I think that's particularly in building up the naval capacity of the Republic of Cyprus, and in particular for counterterrorism purposes.
Thank you. And Mr. Carbonell, Greece and Cyprus are in effect the founding members of all of the ongoing diplomatic initiatives in the Eastern Mediterranean, the various trilaterals, the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. Some have argued for Turkey's inclusion in those initiatives. And my question is, how would you view Turkey's membership in such forums? Of course, particularly given their continued occupation and non-recognition of Cyprus, their challenges to the sovereignty of the inhabited Greek islands, and even their support of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. What's your view of what Turkey's role should be in these other initiatives?
So thank you very much for the question. I think that I think it's not a realistic thing today, tomorrow, in terms of the East Med Gas Forum, at least because of the views of the members there. But if we see a sustained change in Turkey's approach to these countries, in the diplomatic sort of overtures that are going on now lead, to improved relations, I definitely think it would be a good idea to include Turkey in these forums. Despite all of the differences, despite all the considerations you mentioned, there are issues between Egypt and Israel. There are issues between other members of the forum, and part of sort of the idea that energy dialogue could bring closer partnerships, could bring sort of be a build towards greater security cooperation, stability, only works if the forum is inclusive to a certain extent, because Turkey's exclusion has been part of the problem.
Yep, thank you. And also, I know there are many of the Eastern Mediterranean countries like Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, and Turkey that are heavily reliant on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. Lebanon, for example, gets up to 90% of its wheat and cooking oil imports from Russia and Ukraine, according to one report. My question is, how do you view the conflict in Ukraine impacting the humanitarian situation in the region as food becomes scarcer and prices rise? And I'm particularly interested in the ongoing economic crisis and humanitarian crisis in Lebanon.
So my colleagues and I have been looking at the impact of the global commodities shock and food prices and energy prices. I've been looking particularly at the post-Soviet region. I can't say that my expertise extends to Lebanon, but I will mention with respect to Chair Keating's remarks on Turkey, that these are some of the considerations for all of the countries in the region. So Turkey is also impacted by these energy, food price shocks, and that is a very important consideration in the way that they are viewing their balancing act and their reluctance maybe to take a stronger position towards Russia.
Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. For Mr. Kagan, Commander of CENTCOM Mackenzie indicated earlier in the month that there was little evidence regarding foreign fighters traveling from Syria to fight on behalf of Russia. That was earlier in the month, and I'm just wondering, with the advent of the Wagner Group, if anybody's taken another look at that, and if there's any evidence to substantiate that claim at this point, or any evidence of robust recruiting activities in Syria.
Thank you, sir. There is, and my colleagues at the Institute for the Study of War will be releasing a short paper on that this morning, if they haven't already. They are seeing indications that the Russians are in negotiations with various elements in Syria to identify fighters that they could bring back to Ukraine, that they are recruiting people with combat experience for probably immediate fighting, and then they also seem to be attempting to recruit people with less experience, possibly for use down the line. And the team that I direct at the Critical Threats Project has also identified, of course, some Russian or Syrian mercenaries being pulled back from Libya via Syria. I don't think we're going to see a flood of many thousands of Syrians into Ukraine anytime soon, but yes, the Russians are very clearly recruiting and preparing to move some forces and resources from Syria to Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Makovsky, notwithstanding the reporting source, is there any evidence at all that Syrian terrorist fighters may be traveling through Turkey or by any means into Ukraine to fight against the Russians? I can't hear you, sir.
Oh, sorry. Where?
Okay, anybody?
Of any such.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, only to say I'm not aware of any such activity. I suppose you're suggesting that perhaps Turkey would be directing these Syrian
I'm not necessarily suggesting that Turkey would be directing it as much as I might be suggesting that Turkey would turn a blind eye to it. And of course, the security concerns associated with terrorist organizations such as HTS ending up in Ukraine, where the United States, as you know, happens to be supplying a large amount of anti-tank and anti-aircraft weaponry.
Look, I'm not aware of the reports. If Russia asked Turkey to turn a blind eye to such activity,
Russia wouldn't be asking Turkey to turn a blind eye, because these terrorists would be going to fight against Russia. I'm not asking you to find out if Turkey's was asked to turn a blind eye. I'm just asking if there's any information to confirm the reports. And again, the reports, you're going to be, anytime you ask a reasonable question about the reality, you're immediately associated with supporting Vladimir Putin. So let me just say right up front, I don't support anything about Vladimir Putin. But that having been said, is there any evidence that that terrorists from Syria are traveling through Turkey to fight in Ukraine against the Russians?
I apologize, Congressman. I'm not aware of it. And I also apologize because of our connection problem. I thought you were saying going to fight for the Russians. But I understand now you're asking about the Syrian terrorists going to fight for Ukraine, and I'm not aware of such reports.
Okay. Do you know can you answer, do you think that Turkey has prevented armed groups in the area the proliferation of terror organizations? And I ask that in the context of, some people in Congress want us to establish a no-fly zone over Idlib. Meanwhile, we killed Baghdadi and his successor in Idlib. Meanwhile, Turkey's right there. So do you think that they're potentially harboring or safeguarding these individuals and these organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
I have no way to know that. However, I think it's obvious that Turkey was facilitating the transfer through its territory of jihadi fighters to Syria to fight Assad, certainly for several years. I don't know if that's continued, but the ruling government in Turkey has a lot of connections with jihadis. And I agree, it's very disturbing that Baghdadi was found and his successor were found in such proximity to Turkey. And to our knowledge, the Turks did not tip us off about it.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Ms. Titus, if you're ready, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to kind of continue this conversation about Turkey, but in relation to Greece and Cyprus and also Egypt, just kind of the whole neighborhood there. We know last year Egypt signed agreements with Greece and Cyprus related to a subsea cable to link the three countries. And this followed an announcement of the Euro-Asia Interconnector project among Greece and Cyprus and Israel. And that project has received $657 million in funding support from the EU to provide this Euro-Asia interconnector. Mr. Carbonell, I wonder if you would talk about the progress that's being made along that line. Egypt still has a long way to go until it can kind of decarbonize its electric network, but do you think power generated in Africa can be transported to Europe and can kind of replace some of the sources that they have now?
Well, I think that's definitely the goal of these projects. It's looking at the fact that if part of Europe's goal in reducing its reliance on Russia is to accelerate its, even though it will be painful, even though it will be costly, is to accelerate its greening of the economy, then precisely these kinds of electricity interconnectors would be the kind of infrastructure that you need for the future. Whereas if that is the, climate goals that Europe is still aiming for, pipelines might become stranded assets in a number of years.
Is there anything the U.S. can do to be supportive of those efforts?
I think the U.S. is already being supportive of those efforts insofar as they are participating in the 3+1 dialogue, and so far as U.S. has been very active in this kind of energy diplomacy. So I think when the Biden administration said that they were, skeptical, and this was a rhetorical thing because it's not as if the U.S. is funding the East Med gas pipeline. This is really, would be looking for public financing. It's not really up to the U.S. to make those decisions, but rhetorically and in private said that they had some doubts, which I would say from my conversations with people in Greece and Cyprus are shared by officials in those administrations, in closed door meetings. They reemphasize their support for different projects like the interconnectors you just spoke about.
I was talking to the ambassador from Greece here just yesterday, and they were emphasizing how they important they thought the 3+1 agreements are or processes. So I think that's right. Well, speaking of Greece, over the last decade, our engagement militarily with Greece, between the U.S. and Greece, has increased, and the Biden administration has reaffirmed our defense cooperation with Greece. They did that last October, and they've expanded our presence. I wonder if any of you would discuss why this is important, why we need to have a strong presence here in this neighborhood and with Greece, and sending additional forces there. Is that beneficial to guarding NATO's southern flank?
I can maybe say a few words and pass it to one of our co-witnesses. I just say that I think that the U.S. has pivoted to a certain extent, in large part because of the friction with and tensions with Turkey in recent years, towards relying more on Cyprus and Greece as a security partner in the region. I think that's important, and it can be a positive development as long as the U.S. is very conscious of keeping its sort of neutral weight in the region to be able to hold the ring if tensions flare up again. But perhaps somebody else has something to say about
Turkey has not proven to be a very reliable ally.
I don't know if any of the other witnesses want to say something, but.
Well, anybody else want to weigh in? Yes, sir.
The participant.
Please.
Me.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes. The East Med is at the center of three continents, in effect, and Greece is more or less at the center of it. It's very strategically located. Turkey is also extremely strategically located, but Turkey has, in recent years, been a less reliable ally. You mentioned the MDCA expansion in October, I think it's a very dramatic development. I was in Greece in November, and with a East Med task force of Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs. And I have to say, I think we were all struck by how eager the Greeks, both military and civilian, are far expanded cooperation with the United States. It's a head-spinning change from the attitude that Greek governments had up until, let's say, 15 years ago. Some of the aspects of it are really extremely important, like the expansion of the port of Alexandroupoli, which was explained to us by US officials, actually can be, once the railroad structure, modernized railroad structure is in place, can actually be a bypass of the Bosporus and can save time for transporting men and material northward to other NATO allies, Bulgaria, Romania. So yes, look, when we look at Greece's motives, certainly I think their involvement with the United States is partly because they feel it will be a hedge against problems with Turkey, but that's okay. I mean, that's their interest in it. We know how to modulate that relationship. I think it's a great opportunity for us to be in a very important geostrategically located country, which can be used as a base for operations around the region.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Pleased to recognize Ambassador Wagner for 5 minutes.
I thank Chairman Deutch and Chairman Keating for organizing this hearing. Just as the United States can and energy production to help our to offset Europe's dangerous dependence on Russia for energy. The United States should work closely with regional partners to identify ways to
Ambassador Wagner, we're having some challenges with your audio.
Well, I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Are you hearing me now?
Sure, let's try again.
Shall I start from the beginning, or where did I lose you?
Why don't you just start over? I think we would all benefit from your yes.
Just as the United States up its own energy production to help our allies, the Eastern Mediterranean has the potential to offset Europe's dangerous dependence on Russia for energy. The United States should work closely with regional partners to identify ways to cut off sources of Russian influence. These efforts must include our strategic ally, Israel, which has historically played a constructive role in the region and is becoming an energy powerhouse in its own right. As a founding co-chair, one of them, of the Abraham Accords caucus, and I do see Representative Schneider on this hearing, who's been a great partner in this regard. I believe that we must proactively take steps to enhance and expand these transformational agreements. Mr. Makovsky, how might increasing energy cooperation between Israel, Eastern Mediterranean countries, Arab states, and Europe serve as a platform to advance the Abraham Accords?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of interregional connections here between the Middle East, the Gulf, and of course, the northern part of the Eastern Med. yes, I think we're seeing it already. The energy cooperation that we see in the Eastern Med Gas Forum, the cooperation between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus. I think we've seen these units now have engaging in quite a bit of cooperation related, but nevertheless, much of it economic, and there's a lot of investment from the Gulf in Israel, and there was $1 billion worth of trade last year. So I think all of the cooperative efforts in the Eastern Med help to feed into bolstering the Abraham Accords.
Thank you, Mr. Kagan. How do you anticipate that Russia's strategy in the Eastern Mediterranean will change in light of their full-scale invasion of Ukraine? In particular, what impact will the Wagner Group relocating its mercenaries in Libya and Syria to Ukraine have on Russia's strategic ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean?
I think that the Russian general posture in the region and the world is going to change into a more piratical approach, seeking desperately to find resources and cash to offset the tremendous damage that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is doing to Russia on its own and along with our sanctions. I think it's too soon really to assess exactly what direction the Russians will take. I don't think they yet know. And I don't think Putin is spending a lot of time really thinking about what direction he wants to be taking in this region. But I think it will change, and I think it will likely become much more piratical.
I think you're right, and I think it's something that we need to watch as a committee going forward, because I think that posture will change, and I have great concern about that. The war in Ukraine has made it absolutely clear that European energy insecurity urgently requires solutions. Mr. Kagan, how should the United States combine its foreign policy tools and domestic energy resources to accelerate the development of Eastern Mediterranean energy infrastructure?
Ma'am, it's become a matter of vital national security interest for the United States and its NATO allies to decouple Europe from Russian energy sources. This is urgent, it's immediate, and it has to be done, in my opinion, without respect to the questions of long-term viability of any particular energy arrangements. It needs to happen now, and the United States should lean in with all the tools of its power and influence to help Europe decouple fully from Russian energy as quickly as possible.
I thank you. I couldn't agree more. I appreciate both committees joining together for this very important hearing. I have some more questions I'll submit for the record, and I thank both chairmen for their time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Wagner. I will now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Liu for his questions.
Thank you so much, Chairman Deutch and Chairman Keating, for holding this important hearing. As all of you know, Turkey purchased the S-400 missile system from Russia. The U.S. then put sanctions on Turkey and took them out of F-35 program. As some of you may know, right now the S-400 is just sitting there in Turkey. It has not been deployed because Turkey wants to get back into the F-35 program. There's been some talk about transferring that S-400 to Ukraine. What are your thoughts on the viability of that transfer happening?
Sure, I can't answer the question of whether one could persuade the Turks to do it. I could tell you that it is urgently needed in Ukraine, and it would be a huge benefit for the entire alliance, for everyone who's backing Ukraine, for the Ukrainian people, and for relations between the U.S. and Turkey, if there were any way to persuade Erdogan to make that deal.
What do you think is preventing him from doing that? He's already given drones to Ukraine that are killing Russian soldiers and attacking Russian equipment.
So I would leave that to people on the panel who are more expert on Turkey, if that's okay with you.
So I'll just ask the question, what do you think would prevent Turkey from doing this after they've already given lethal drones to Ukraine? You can just speak, anyone can answer.
Go ahead, that's right.
I'll just say very briefly that I think that for Erdogan, the two issues are separate. And so he said, I mean, he's going to probably not buy more S-400s, and the war in Ukraine has definitely made this a very stark issue. And now Turkey is less likely to, is more likely to already look for ways in which to sort of hedge its bets in terms of the S-400s, but sending them to Ukraine is a very different issue. And it's not necessarily one that I think is in the cards, despite reports about that.
All right, thank you. So Greece uses the S-300 missile system. What's the reason, in your opinion, that Greece doesn't send its S-300 to Ukraine, and then we could backfill Greece with a Patriot missile system? And anyone can answer that question. Maybe it's a good idea without an answer, which is fine too.
I think the issues are twofold, as I understand it. The first is the potential risks of escalation, and that's sort of a NATO decision. And the second is whether the S-300s, and particularly in the case of the S-400s, whether the Ukrainians would be able to effectively use them. But I think it's the first problem, which is that NATO is very worried about escalation.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate that. And I'm just going to take the rest of my time and talk a little bit about escalation. If you see those ridiculous pictures of Vladimir Putin sitting 60 feet away from nearest human being, I think what it shows is a man that is very scared of getting sick, very scared of dying, which tells me he is not suicidal. So the notion that Putin, who is having trouble taking on a smaller, less well-equipped Ukrainian military, is now going to engage NATO, I think is ludicrous. I think NATO should, of course, take escalation into account, but stop fearing escalation the way it has before the invasion. What we need now is for NATO to make the decision to win. We need NATO to give Ukraine everything Ukraine has requested. And the best way to get Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table is to crush his forces in Ukraine, crush him on the battlefield. The only reason that he is not still continuing to try to take over Kyiv and install a puppet government is because of the amazing skill and will of the Ukrainian military and the lethal weapons we've provided Ukraine. And we need to continue providing more of those weapons and additional weapons. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Mast, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Deutch. I appreciate it. Ms. Carbonell, I really took notice to some of the things that you said in your testimony. And I just wanted to dive into some of those things a little bit. Just a couple of quotes. You said, when it comes to new big investments to unlock more gas in the Eastern Med, today's urgency will rub up against long-term climate goals. What do you mean by rub up?
Well, I mean that if the goal is to get gas to Europe tomorrow or in the next 3 to 5 years, big pipelines and greenfield production is not going to deliver that goal. So if you're looking further out, if you're looking at getting pipeline gas to Europe from the East Med, there are other ways to get gas, right? You can go through the LNG.
You said it would rub up against long-term climate goals. How does it rub up against long-term climate goals?
For the moment, yes, for the moment, Europe has made accelerating its transition to green energy part of its goals and also part of its strategy to reduce reliance on Russia. That includes no more public financing by the EBDR, by the EIB for pipeline projects. So there's a real question mark about financing for these kinds of projects going forward.
So rub up, you just mean they're just not going to fund them. That, like, just to sum it up, you're just saying they're just not going to fund them.
I'm saying that those projects need to find financing, and whether or not they have political support, yeah.
That's funding.
As
So
long as, yeah.
you would say that both public and private financing, that would be fair to say. It's the regulatory environment creates a very unlikely situation for them to get public or private financing. That would be accurate.
I think that as long as companies and public financiers believe that there's a chance that those assets will no longer be, or that gas will no longer be in demand in 10 years' time, yes, it's a challenge.
Would you, I know your expertise is Europe and Middle East, but would you say that same sentiment is also in the United States of America, that an increase in gas production or pipelines rub up against long-term climate goals for the administration here?
So I think that actually Europe has been more forthcoming about saying gas is a transition fuel. So saying that, you know, the move from coal, which is the dirtiest form of energy, to gas and gas-fired power plants is part of its trajectory towards a greener or
But does the U.S. fall into the same thing? Is the U.S. also rubbing up against long-term climate goals to get more gas into the U.S.?
So I think the U.S. Produces enough of its own gas supply at the moment. I can't tell you whether, you know, there's a very active debate over these issues in the U.S. and I don't think...
You must be pretty disconnected if you think that we produce enough of our own. I would say, to the opinion of pretty much every single American out there, if that's your belief. But you're allowed to have your own beliefs. We're all, at least conservatives, we believe everybody is allowed to have their own beliefs. So not everybody believes that in this world. I do want to continue on this and ask another question as it relates to Ukraine. If Ukraine war number 2, hypothetically, took place in another 5 years, would it be good to have those pipelines in place, like what so many have been discussing the Eastern Med pipeline?
So I think that it's up for policymakers and politicians such as yourself to set the goals of where the economy needs to be. And
no doubt, but we asked you here for your opinion as policymakers.
My opinion is that energy security is incredibly important, and Ukraine has shown that to be true. So I think, you know, it's worth mentioning that when we're talking about energy diplomacy...
So would it be good to have those pipelines if there were a Ukraine war number 2 in 3 years or 5 years, if, pray to God, this came to an end soon?
Yeah, may I just say that, you know, if the idea is that pipelines are going to bring peace, that's more complicated, and the war in Ukraine shows that that's, you know, that was Germany's goal, and that didn't really, you know, that was one of Germany's foreign policy
objectives. I think
objectives.
the idea is that there's less kilowatt per hour for somebody paying for electricity, less cost for them to drive a vehicle down the road or get a good or anything else from A to B. So just lifestyle and quality of life, I think those are, you know, the ideas, and national security, of course, for Europeans and us as Americans. Pretty big deals. I don't remember the last time we tapped into our strategic wind reserve. I will yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Mr. Schneider, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, and I want to thank you for having this committee, our witnesses, for sharing us your perspectives and enduring what sometimes are unfair personal attacks and unnecessary. I want to, before I go to questions, I want to reference something I said earlier, specifically about Israel. Israel is our most important ally in the region, perhaps one of our most important allies in the world. It's a relationship based both on shared values and common interests. And with the chairman, I actually had the chance to be in Israel last month, and we were at the border with Syria. Israel faces on that border not just Iranian troops, IRGC forces, but Iranian-supported militia, Hezbollah forces, Syrian forces, and is doing everything it can to protect her citizens and her borders from Iran's nefarious intentions on the ground, as well as we work to make sure Iran never is able to get a nuclear weapon. What we know is that Israel is able to take action against Iran in Syria, but Russia is also there. And so they are balancing their interests. Our common values with Israel is reflected in Israel's efforts to broker peace, working with Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. And I just wanted to say that I was grateful for their work. When we talk about the Middle East, and I'm probably going to focus on Mr. Makovsky and Professor Eissenstat, but we oftentimes fall into platitudes. It's a complicated issue in the Middle East. We're always seeming to be at inflection points, and you have to discuss both opportunities at risk. They're platitudes because they're true, and they're essentially what we are facing every single day, now as much as any other time. And Mr. Makovsky, you touched about the regional interconnectedness to this and some of the changes that we're seeing. You talked about the forces driving it, the gas finds in the Eastern Med over the last decade, the Syrian war, and specifically Russian intervention in 2015. Turkey's changing intentions, ambitions, and role, specifically vis-a-vis the Arab Middle East. And now we have the war in Ukraine. If we look at the inter-regional connections, it is the Eastern Med, it is the Black Sea, it is the Arabian Sea and the Gulf. All of these intersect in this region. I was grateful for my colleague, Ann Wagner, to talk about the Abraham Accords Caucus that I'm proud to co-chair with her and others. The Abraham Accords are a great accomplishment. You have the trilateral arrangements with Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, but others. There's a lot of things happening, and this is a big lead up to I guess the question is, how do all these play together? And if we look not just in the context of pushing back and holding Russia to account and ensuring Russia endures a strategic defeat in Ukraine, but also the longer term impacts of lifting up the standard of living and prospects for peace of the entire region, Eastern Med, as well as the Arab states, Israel and Palestinians. How does all this fit together? You're still on mute, Mr. Makovsky.
My apologies, Congressman. These clusters of cooperation, I think, are very much about economics and the Eastern Med Gas Forum. Look, I just reiterate, I mean, Eastern Gas Forum, this is an opportunity for really boosting economic development throughout the region. Israel is around, and if the Hamas problem in Gaza, the Palestinians have access to gas off the coast of Gaza. So, yes, sorry, sir.
I'm going to reclaim my time only because unfortunately we have a bad connection, but I think you're focusing on the Eastern Med Gas Forum, which is important because it includes, as you noted in your testimony, 3 EU countries, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy. It's Arab states, Egypt and Jordan. It's Israel, it's the PA, and maybe can expand. But all these work together in creating opportunities for peace. Professor Eisenstadt, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I guess I would make a couple of points. The first is that the primacy of Ukraine has really important impacts for the effectiveness of what you're talking about, right? That particularly with regard to Turkey. Turkey is going to is waiting to see how things are going to develop, and if Ukraine collapses, God forbid, then it's going to draw closer to Russia. If Ukraine succeeds and Russia is proven to be as weak as it appears to be right now, then Turkey is going to move closer to the West. And I think that that's what's gone on in the last few years is a reflection, like the greater cooperation is a reflection of how badly Turkey's aggressiveness has backfired for it. It has, and it's up to us now to highlight that if Turkey becomes more cooperative, if it works with its regional partners more effectively, then there's a lot of benefit waiting for it.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but as you said, there's a lot of benefit. We have the opportunity here. There are opportunities and risks. When we lead with our values, when we protect our interests, we can do great things. And I look forward to continuing this conversation, having more hearings like this, and seeing good things happening in the Eastern Med and throughout the region. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Burchett, you're recognized.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you, and I'm sorry you're leaving us. I know that Greg Stubbe and August Pfluger have a Brooks and Dunn cover band. Maybe you could get them to sing a little You're Gonna Miss Me When I'm Gone as your walkout music when you finally leave Congress, because we're gonna miss you, brother. So
thanks, Mr. Burchett. I'll see if I can arrange that. You're recognized.
Thank you, brother. Given the energy insecurities facing Europe, how should the U.S. be working with Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and others to bring the natural gas from the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean to the European market? Go ahead, brother.
Of course, I don't want to say I'm an energy expert, but the politics of energy is something I've looked at very closely in the region. I don't think either of the pipeline ideas, the Eastern Med gas pipeline or Turkey pipeline, are very realistic. I think the most likely way for us to help Europe is through from the Eastern Med is through LNG from Egypt to Greece. And Israel is already sending gas to Egypt to be liquefied. My understanding is Egypt has 2 liquefaction facilities. My understanding they have a capacity of up to 20 BCM. That doesn't measure up to the 150 plus BCM. I understand that Europe imports from Russia, but it would help, and I think it's something that could be done fairly quickly. So yes, I think that that is the route that we should be encouraging.
Thank you. And I'm also concerned about the state of Lebanon, especially because the shortage of wheat that they'll face as a result of Russia and Ukraine, and because of the rising fuel prices that we're all experiencing. Besides weakening sanctions on Syria to allow natural gas pipeline in Lebanon, what can be done to help this country? Anyone?
Are you asking me?
I will. I'm
Anybody wants to jump in on it?
But in addition, sorry. In addition to the pipeline, there are also efforts to try to resolve maritime disputes between Israel and Lebanon, which, Lebanese officials, I understand, hope is going to unlock their own potential to explore in the region. So that's worth mentioning. But I don't know, on the energy front, that's the only 2 efforts that I know the U.S. has a role in already existing.
Alan, do you want to add something to that, brother?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm not sure exactly because there's so many problems in Lebanon, but it seems to me the most imminent one is a humanitarian one because of Lebanon's dependence for grain on Russia and Ukraine. I know one Lebanese official I spoke with last week said we have 4 weeks worth of grain. We need to find a solution if this war continues. So I think the humanitarian one, that's something that the United States ideally can look at.
All right. How much time do I have left, Mr. Mr. Chairman.
Well, you have just over a minute, Mr. Burchett.
Okay, thank you, sir. One last question, and anybody answer this that could. Does Russia's relative, you seem like their failure in the Ukraine, excuse me, destroy their appearance of invincibility in Syria?
It should. The Ukrainians have demonstrated that an air force that is far less capable than the Israeli Air Force or our Air Force is able to prevent the Russians from establishing air superiority, prevent them from using their S-300, S-400 systems optimally, and continue to conduct ground attack against Russian forces despite all of those systems. It absolutely should make it clear that the notion of Russian strength and invincibility that they've projected in Syria was a Potemkin force in some respects, particularly if you look at what, again, I think the Israeli Air Force, the United States Air Force could do against them if hostilities were to arise.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, yield back the remainder of my time, and we're going to miss you, brother.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. We'll see each other a lot before I go. Don't worry. Next, Ms. Tenney, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Tenney, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this meeting. Thank you to the witnesses. I guess my first question I would like to ask to Mr. Makovsky, and it's just I just thought if you could just briefly state that there seems to be an uptick in Arabian Gulf countries' interest in Eastern Mediterranean. What's the best way to channel that interest that's consistent with U.S. national interests in the region? If you could just maybe comment on what's happening and how should we be handling that from a foreign policy perspective?
Yeah, there have been connections. Greece in particular has supplied patriots to Saudi Arabia. There have been exercises on Crete by Saudi Arabia. The UAE and Greece signed a military cooperation agreement. But I think, look, Israel is the one at the nexus of this between the East Med and the Gulf. And I think the best way to encourage the development of U.S. interest through this process is to support the Abraham Accords and to support the various Eastern Mediterranean clusters that we've been discussing. So I think it's important for the U.S. to get involved at a senior level. I know that Greece, Cyprus, and Israel have been very eager to have Secretary of State Blinken join a meeting so they can say that the 3+1 is a strong interest of the Biden administration as well. And I think that's key, is to have a senior level representation as much as we can with these groups.
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And to Mr. Kagan, could you just get into a little bit about any kind of disinformation operations that Russia has in the Eastern Mediterranean, and what we can do as U.S. policy to counter these? Could you just explain briefly what that is? So I got another question for you dealing with Russia.
Yes, ma'am. The Russians are constantly running disinformation operations of all sorts. At the moment, they're in a little bit of disarray for obvious reasons, and I think that they're in the process of trying to come up with a coherent narrative about what exactly they're going to be doing in the Eastern Mediterranean and why they're recruiting forces and so on. So I'm not detecting at the moment a particularly coherent information operation in the Eastern Mediterranean from the Russians just yet.
So that's something to come. So let me ask you something. How does Russia use its naval base in Syria? And in what ways is this a threat, obviously, to U.S. national interests? What can we do about it on the foreign policy level?
So the Russians established their position at the naval base and, of course, the air base as well to reestablish their presence and make themselves a Mediterranean power again. It facilitates that base is the hub of their activity in the MENA region generally and supports their activities in Libya as well, and other activities that I think they desired and intended to conduct. Those bases have relied heavily on the appearance of Russian military strength to give Russia leverage in the region. And I think that we will need to think about exactly how to take advantage of the fact that that appearance has turned out to be just an appearance and not real. And that we need to recalibrate and help other countries in the region recalibrate how they look at those bases and how they think about Russian presence and Russia as an alternative, Russia as a significant player, Russia as a broker, given the tremendous weakness that Russia is displaying right now.
So in terms of, say, the East Med pipeline, whether it's feasible or not, I know it's a very expensive project, but is that something we should worry about Russia intervening, coming from the south into that region? What is your view on that? Is that something we shouldn't be concerned about at this point?
The Russians will interfere with everything that alleviates European dependence on Russian energy as much as they can. I don't know that will actually lead to Russian military activities against the pipeline, but you can be certain that the Russians will weigh in every way that they can to disrupt the development of alternatives to Russian energy supplies to Europe.
Well, thank you so much for your questions. I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Tenney. Mr. Fleury, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to all the witnesses, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that, quite frankly, I've been talking about for over a year now, which is energy security. And I think there's never been a more poignant time to discuss it with regards to Europe and the different flows and alternative sources that I think are going to be really important. Ms. Carbonell, I'd like to thank you for your discussion points and kind of go back to your opening statement about the issues created around the current administration's decision to withdraw from the East Med pipeline. And now that we look at the events that are happening in Ukraine, can you kind of give us your perspective on whether or not the administration should reevaluate their stance on this? I mean, is now the time to reevaluate, to get to a yes, and to offer a solution in Eastern Mediterranean that diversifies Europe's LNG source?
So I think I'll reiterate something that I've already said in the sense that the U.S. support or lack thereof for the pipeline remains a rhetorical question. At the end of the day, the gas is being pumped to Europe, which would be the main clients. The funding will have to come from other places. And so the viability or not of the pipeline, I think, is an assessment that the Biden administration made. But it's certainly not the Biden administration or Washington that is deciding these issues, but markets, to be frank.
Would you say that those markets depend on a stable political climate that encourages the use of a very clean fuel, both here at home domestically and also with regards to the import terminals? That there's 14 currently awaiting decision inside Europe. Germany has reportedly agreed and committed to opening their 2 of the 14. But don't you think policy drives marketplace in this case?
Certainly, I've been repeating, but I think the EU has made some quite radical decisions. Whether they decide that they are going to reevaluate their timeline for use of gas as a transition fuel and the immediacy and the emergency that they are now facing is really up to regulators in Europe, and we've seen a lot of changes. So we can't rule out that there will be a reevaluation, an even deeper reevaluation than already of energy policy. Currently, Europe is burning much more coal than it was a few months ago. So.
Well, I think that's just the point. Is now is the time to open our eyes up to what that market reality is, and if we care about things like climate and our planet, then a fuel like LNG, a clean burning fuel that we do much better and much more efficiently than the Russians. This is our chance to compete with the Russians. Mr. Kagan, I'd like to kind of switch to you a little bit on that competition factor and try to understand your thoughts on the military aspects of this, especially the Russian Navy and the competition that's happening in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. Does the buildup, I mean, this has been building up since I was fighting in Syria in 2016, 2017. I mean, this is not new, but how concerning is their presence to the infrastructure and the thoughts of infrastructure when it relates to energy?
Well, listen, I've been very concerned about the Russian move into the Mediterranean since it began, and I've thought that the U.S. and our allies should have been doing what we could to delay, prevent, reduce, and persuade the Russians to not do this and drive out, rather than accepting them as a presence in the region. The Russians have demonstrated that they are a destabilizing presence in any region where they operate when they're not actually overt aggressors. And I think that this is an important moment for us to think about what kinds of pressures we can bring on the Russians generally to cause them to recalibrate and try to get them to pull back. I certainly don't want to court a conflict with Russia. I don't want to court a military conflict with Russia. But I also think that we need to reevaluate how scared we need to be about the threat of some other kind of diplomatic escalation rising to the level of a military conflict. I just don't think that we need to be as concerned about how that could go in the Mediterranean as I think we have been. And so I think we should take advantage of that to consider what kinds of pressures we can bring on the Russians to try to get them out of a region that they don't belong in and where they are simply a negative player.
Well, thank you both. It's time to put Midland over Moscow and compete where we can. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pfluger. Ms. Malliotakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate the discussion today. I think a lot of it obviously is centering around the need for energy independence, not just here in the United States, but abroad, particularly with our allies. And my question revolves around the Eastern Mediterranean gas pipeline. This is a project that had broad diplomatic support in the region. It had bipartisan support among members of Congress. And the decision by the Biden administration, I believe, to pull its support undercuts European gas alternatives as the continent looks to wean itself off of Russian oil and gas and empowers regional troublemakers like Russia and Turkey, and diminishes America's reputation in Europe. My question is, do you believe it was appropriate for the State Department to make this change in policy without consulting Congress? And also, what is the State Department doing to help bring Eastern Mediterranean gas online quickly so it can serve as an alternative to Russian gas? If we don't know what they're doing, maybe you could say what you suggest that they do.
I feel like I've been speaking. I'll just make a very quick point because I think we've been speaking a lot about this issue and focusing on the climate goals. I will say that when it comes to the East Med gas pipeline, even though I do not think, I don't know, but I do not think this was part of the administration's goals. It has been a source of tension with Turkey, and part of this conversation has also been about how to bring Turkey, to be a more constructive player in East Med dynamics. And so I think it's important to highlight that this has been a positive development, at least in Ankara's engagement with other actors in the region. In terms of other means, Alan and support for, efforts to pipe gas instead and to Egypt from Israel, potentially from Cyprus, and export it via LNG terminal is certainly the quickest way to try to get new supplies to Europe. So
I appreciate you touched on something. What I would say, it's called Turkish appeasement. Turkey has been illegally occupying a third of Cyprus and for decades now. And just recently, the United Nations denounced and condemned the decision by Turkey to reopen a residential section of what was an abandoned area named Varosha. They warned that it could raise tensions on the divided Mediterranean island. And I have serious concerns about whether Turkey is acting as a good actor or an adversary. I mean, we see this time and again. We saw this with the S-400s purchasing from Russia. We see this now trying to come back into Americans' good graces by wanting to purchase the F-16s, and the role that they're playing currently with Ukraine and Russia. I mean, do you believe that NATO, United States, should be a little more firm with what we expect from Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean? They've shown aggression as of late in and around the islands, the exclusive economic zone. They violate international law. I guess what I'm trying to say is they are a NATO ally, but sometimes they act like an adversary. They're illegally occupying Cyprus. What should we be doing as the United States to try to hold them accountable and get them to do the right thing, not always just appeasing what Erdogan wants?
If I may, I think that the amount of pressure that we put on, or for that matter, the amount of inducements that we offer, really depends on what sort of opportunities are out there. In the case of Turkey right now, I don't think that either inducements or pressure is going to get much from them. And that's in large part because we have elections coming up in June 2023. What I would suggest is that if the elections produce either a mixed government or a government that led by the opposition, there's a lot of ifs and buts to get there. But if that's the case, we can assume that whatever new government comes to power will be very anxious to work with the European Union, to work with the regional partners to sort of normalize relations. For the time being, I don't expect Turkey to back down off of Cyprus because it's such a consensus issue within Turkish public opinion.
Thank you. I've run out of time. I know it looks like Alan wanted to comment, but it seems I ran out of time.
Okay. Mr. Makovsky, you can respond.
Thank you, Chairman. You have to unmute yourself, Alan.
Apologies. Just regarding Cyprus, Turkey has taken a couple of particularly unhelpful positions in recent times regarding, as you said, opening Varosha and also insisting on a two-state solution. I think one of the things the United States should do is, and this may sound very bureaucratic, but we used to have a special Cyprus coordinator. Placed on the issue and also a means for pushing the sides to negotiate. I think that position ought to be reestablished by the administration. I think that would help. I think the current Turkish position on Cyprus is something we do strongly need to oppose.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Malliotakis. And Mr. Meyer, I will yield to you for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of our witnesses here today. I think this is a critical and important subject and ever relevant, given just the interplay between energy security within the Middle East and now energy security within not just Eastern and Central Europe, but also Western Europe as well. I guess first to Mr. Kagan, the Biden administration's withdrawal from supporting the EastMed gas pipeline. We've discussed a little bit about the tensions between our NATO partners, Greece and Turkey, obviously the status of Cyprus, which was just discussed about with Ms. Malliotakis. To what extent, in your estimation, was the Biden administration's decision to withdraw support predicated on maybe effort at a diplomatic détente versus influenced more by overarching beliefs in our energy balance?
Sir, I apologize. It's way outside my expertise to offer opinions or assessments on that.
Would any of the other witnesses like to offer an opinion or assessment on that? Hearing none.
I will just say that I think that it was more of the latter, in the sense that, as far as I know, the decision was communicated in private, and the intent was not to make big bold statements in favor of a rapprochement with Turkey. But that's as far as I know.
Okay. And I guess would the general consensus be, given what we have seen in the past? Sorry. Was somebody else hoping to speak on that? I believe Mr. Makovsky, I think you're coming in broken. Or Mr. Makovsky, I think your signal is weak and you're coming in a little bit broken there. I guess I'll move on a little bit, just with what we've seen, obviously, with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and what had been prior a veiled threat made incredibly explicit about Russia using its natural gas connections to Europe as a means of additional political leverage. Would anyone like to comment or offer, their perspectives on if this is an opportune time for re-engagement, if there could be a better resolution that could be spurred that may offer some more short and medium-term stability in terms of natural gas supplies to the European continent?
I'll be happy to offer you the observation that what Russia has just done should have demonstrated to everyone that the fiction that the Europeans have been presenting to themselves in the world, that their dependence on Russian energy was not going to be weaponized by Russia in some way, is a nonsense and is a fiction. Russia weaponizes everything that it has, and the whole point of the energy interconnectedness that it has created with Europe has been to create the kind of leverage that it has tried to use. That was the whole point of Nord Stream 2. And it is shocking to me and very disappointing that the German government continues to try to maintain as much of the elements of this fiction as it can and pretend that it is in some way other than harmful to NATO, Germany, and our alliances, as well as Ukraine, to maintain any kind of dependence on Russian energy.
And Mr. Kagan, I could not agree more. I think this has been an exercise in fears being realized, in empty assurances being shown to be as empty as they were, and on just a fundamental reality of granting another nation leverage over your own policy and creating that dependency, which is why I'm a strong proponent of doing everything we can to have redundancies, to avoid dependencies, but also making sure that we're interconnecting and not creating unintentional bottlenecks. And obviously what we've seen with the challenges and the difficulties of rapidly reallocating natural gas, if there isn't a pipeline, you need an LNG tanker. There's only so many LNG tankers. There's only so many LNG facilities, and the difficulties that those cause will be with us for quite a long time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate this conversation, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer. All right, seeing no other members, let me just ask a couple of questions before we conclude. First of all, I want to ask about the 3+1 mechanism, and specifically, given the success we've seen of U.S., Greece, Cyprus, and Israel working together in this way, what more? And I guess Mr. Makovsky, and I would suggest perhaps keeping your video off. Perhaps that will help this with the signal. What more can the U.S. do to strengthen the engagement with under 3+1? If you're still there, Mr. Makovsky. Okay, perhaps not. Let me then just take a step back and go back to the to the reason, to the title of the hearing, Opportunities and Challenges in East Med. We've spent a fair amount of time with some really interesting and important exchanges on the many challenges in the Eastern Med and beyond. I want to ask each of the witnesses to talk about the opportunities we've seen. I mentioned the 3+1. We've talked about the East Med Gas Forum. We talked about incorporating all of this within the Abraham Accords framework. And given all of that, I guess we'll just, Dr. Eisenstadt, I'll start with you. As you assess these dramatic changes that have taken place, what are the opportunities you see, the most significant opportunities that you see as we look out into the future for the region?
Great, thank you. So I'll focus on Turkey and its role in the region. I think the first is that the crisis in Ukraine has driven home to Turkey just how vulnerable it is. I think it's a time when we can make clear that many of its issues can be resolved if it works with its allies. I don't think that we should necessarily give anything away for free, but I think that there's certainly opportunities for real diplomacy. The second point I would make with regard to Turkey is that precisely because Erdogan has made such bad decisions, Turkey's economy is in shambles. That leaves him more vulnerable than he has ever been. And so there is the possibility moving forward 18 months for a new government that will be more sympathetic to working with its Western partners. And we should be supporting the democratic process and driving home the idea that any circumvention of the democratic process will result in a real break with the United States.
I appreciate that. The democratic process, I think, fair to say, on full display in the 3+1, given the democracies that are the U.S., Israel, Greece, and Cyprus. I'm going to, Dr. Kagan, I'll turn to you. I want to be respectful. If you have thoughts here on opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean looking ahead in light of the conversations that we've had today.
I second Mr. Eisenstadt's comments. I think Erdogan has made a series of terrible decisions. It's a long list, but the notion that he could use Russia to balance against the West has been revealed to be a catastrophic miscalculation. And I think that it is an opportunity for us to help him and Turkey understand that that's not a good thing. Generally in the region, we have seen Russian, who are now revealed as basically snake oil salesmen, going around the region, offering Russia as an alternative to the U.S. and offering Russia as a way to balance against the U.S. or balance against others facing U.S. withdrawal. That is being revealed as a very bad bet. Russia is not effective as a partner to balance with the U.S. against. And I think that that is also an opportunity for us to shore up our alliances and partnerships and build on the great work that's been done along those lines and get people to understand that we are the best option in the region and that we should lead and people should work with us to do the right thing in the region.
Thanks, Dr. Kagan. Ms. de Carbonnel, again, given what Dr. Kagan just described, is the strengthening relationships between Greece and Cyprus and Israel, the United States, brought into the East Med Gas Forum. What additional opportunities does that provide looking ahead?
So I'll build on what has just been said in terms of Turkey. I think that the strength of energy dialogue means it is is made stronger if it's inclusive. So in ways to find revenue sharing agreements on the island of Cyprus, ways to prevent Turkey from being a spoiler in development inter-region, in dynamics. I think that it's important to look at these tensions and conflicts and look for ways to resolve them in order to really get the full benefit of the opportunities of the energy resources in the region.
I appreciate that. I refer back to some comments made by Ms. Meliatakis and Ms. Titus with respect to the role that that Turkey has chosen to play to date, whether it is the continued occupation of Cyprus or actions in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think there's a long way to go along your lines. And Mr. Makovsky, you're back, and so we'll let you have the last word here, both in terms, general terms, as we look ahead and think about the opportunities in the Eastern Med that have grown from the growing relationship that we've spent the morning discussing, and then specifically the E3 or the 3+1 mechanism, and what more the United States can do to really expand it and strengthen that.
Well, as you said, Mr. Chairman, I think 3+1 with Greece, Cyprus, and Israel is really the core of all these efforts. These are the three most democratic states. These are the ones that share our values of all of these new clusters that are in Israel. It would be very important to see a ministerial level meeting. Us, again, in a leadership role, trying to bring together some of these trilaterals, and particularly the one involving Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. It would be very good to bring that together with the one with Israel, which I think would reinforce Israeli-Egyptian relations. Was at the meeting in Sde-Boker, Israel, the other day with the Abraham Accords ministers, as well as with the Egyptian foreign minister. I don't think the Egyptian would have been there had it not been for Secretary Blinken's presence. So I think these groups represent an opportunity for us to really influence in an intimate way the decisions of the provided that we're willing to do it at a senior level. I did just want to say on Turkey that I agree with my remarks, and certainly we should be pushing for a more democratic Turkey, but relations with Turkey, I fear, are going to be stuck until this S-400 issue is taken care of. And I know Turkey feels that Russia has a lot of levers over it in terms of energy, but particularly, most important, its ability to drive Syrian refugees into Turkey. Turkey already has 1 million Syrian refugees, fears having more. And so it doesn't want to push Russia too far, but it's got to get rid of the S-400s. I think giving them to Ukraine or giving them to someone else to give to Ukraine would have been a very, very elegant solution and would have served both Turkey's and, as a matter of fact, Erdogan's interests in the long run.
I thank you, Mr. Makovsky. I thank all of the witnesses and members for being here today. I would agree completely with Mr. Makovsky's main point that I think we would all agree that American leadership always matters. That is especially true in this region, given the opportunities ahead and the extent to which they can be expanded significantly with that strong American leadership. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. Members who have additional questions will submit those. We ask our witnesses to please respond to them in writing, And I would request my colleagues that any witness questions for the hearing record be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And with that, and without objection, at least with respect to the format, next time we're hoping to do this in person without the technical problems. But I'm grateful again to all of you, and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.